Geoffrey Chaucer, 1340 to 1400. He was a man full of the blood and beer of merry England, capable of taking in his stride the natural difficulties of life, drawing their sting with a forgiving humor, and picturing all phases of the English scene with a brush as broad as Homer's, a spirit as lusty as Rabelais'. His name, like so much of his language, was of French origin. It meant shoemaker, and probably was pronounced Chaucer. Posterity plays tricks with our very names and remembers us only to remake us to its whim. He was the son of John Chaucer, a London vintner. He won a good education from both books and life. His poetry abounds in knowledge of men and women, literature and history. In 1357, Geoffrey Chaucer was officially listed in the service of the household of the future Duke of Clarence. 2 years later, he was off to the wars in France. He was captured but was freed for a ransom, to which Edward III contributed. In 1367 we find him a yeoman of the King's Chamber, with a life pension of 20 marks, or about $1,333 a year. Edward traveled much with his household at his heels. Presumably Chaucer accompanied him, savoring England as he went. In 1366 he married Philippa, a lady serving the Queen, and lived with her in moderate discord till her death. Richard II continued the pension, and John of Gaunt added £10, or about $1,000, annually. There were other aristocratic gifts, which may explain why Chaucer, who saw so much of life, took little notice of the Great Revolt. It was a pleasant custom of those days, which admired poetry and eloquence, to send men of letters on diplomatic missions abroad. So Chaucer was deputed with 2 others to negotiate a trade agreement at Genoa in 1372. And in 1378 he went with Sir Edward Berkeley to Milan. Who knows but he may have met ailing Boccaccio, aging Petrarch. In any case, Italy was a transforming revelation to him. He saw there a culture far more polished, lettered, and subtle than England's. He learned a new reverence for the classics, at least the Latin. The French influence that had molded his early poems yielded now to Italian ideas, verse forms, and themes. When finally he turned to his own land for his scenes and characters, he was an accomplished artist and a mature mind. No man could then live in England by writing poetry. We might have supposed that Chaucer's pensions would keep him adequately housed, fed, and clad. After 1378 they totaled some $10,000 in the money of our time. Besides, his wife enjoyed her own pensions from John of Gaunt and the king. In any case, Chaucer felt a need to supplement his income by taking various governmental posts. For 12 years, from 1374 to 1386, he served as Controller of the Customs and Subsidies, and during that time he occupied lodgings over the Aldgate Tower. In 1380 he paid an unstated sum to Cecilia Champagne for withdrawing her suit against him for rape. 5 years later he was appointed Justice of the Peace for Kent, and in 1386 he had himself elected to Parliament. It was in the intervals of these labors that he wrote his poetry. He describes himself in the House of Fame as hurrying home after he had made his reckonings and losing himself in his books, sitting dumb as a stone and living like a hermit in all but poverty, chastity, and obedience, and setting his wit to make books, songs, and ditties in rhyme. In his youth, he tells us, he had written many a song and lecherous lay. He translated Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy into good prose, and part of Guillaume de Lorris's Roman de la Rose into excellent verse. He began a number of what may be called major-minor poems: The House of Fame, The Book of the Duchess, The Parliament of Fowls, and The Legend of Good Women. He anticipated us in being unable to finish them. They were ambitious yet timid tentatives, frank imitations, in theme and form, of continental origins. In his finest single poem, Troilus and Cressida, he continued to imitate, even to translate. But to 2,730 lines that he lifted from Boccaccio's Philostrato, he added 5,696 lines of other provenance, or coined in his own mint. He made no attempt to deceive. He repeatedly referred to his source and apologized for not translating at all. Such transfers from one literature to another were considered legitimate and useful, for even well-educated men could not then understand any vernacular but their own. Plots, as Greek and Elizabethan dramatists felt, were common property, Art lay in the form. Despite all discounts, Chaucer's Troilus is the first great narrative poem in English. Scott called it long and somewhat dull, which it is. Rossetti called it perhaps the most beautiful narrative poem of considerable length in the English language, and this too is true. All long poems, however beautiful, become dull. Passion is of poetry's essence, and a passion that runs to 8,386 lines becomes prose almost as rapidly as desire consummated. Never were so many lines required to bring a lady to bed, and seldom has love hesitated, meditated, procrastinated, and capitulated with such magnificent and irrelevant rhetoric, and melodious conceits, and facile felicity of rhyme. Only Richardson's Mississippi of prose could rival this Nile of verse in the leisurely psychology of love. Yet even the heavy-winged oratory, the infinite wordiness, the obstructive erudition obstinately displayed, failed to destroy the poem. It is, after all, a philosophic tale of how woman is designed for love, and will soon love B if A stays too long away. It has one character livingly portrayed, Pandarus, who in the Iliad is the leader of the Lycian army in Troy, but here becomes the exuberant, resourceful, undiscourageable go-between to guide the lovers to their sin, and thereby hangs a word. Troilus is a warrior absorbed in repelling the Greeks, and scornful of men who, dallying on soft bosoms, become the thralls of appetite. He falls deliriously in love with Cressida at first sight, and thereafter thinks of nothing else but her beauty, modesty, gentleness, and grace. Cressida, after waiting anxiously through 6,000 lines for this timid soldier to announce his love, falls with relief into his arms, and Troilus forgets two worlds at once. All other dreads were and from him fled, both of the siege and his salvation. Having exhausted himself in achieving this ecstasy, Chaucer hurries over the bliss of the lovers to the tragedy that rescues it from boredom. Cressida's father having deserted to the Greeks, she is sent to them by the angry Trojans in exchange for the captured Antenor. The broken-hearted lovers part with vows of everlasting fidelity. Arriving among the Greeks, Cressida is awarded to Diomedes, whose handsome virility so captivates his captive that, qual plum invento, she surrenders in a page what before had been hoarded through a book. Perceiving which, Troilus plunges into battle seeking Diomedes, and finds death on Achilles' spear. Chaucer ended his amorous epic with a pious prayer to the Trinity, and sent it, conscience-stricken, to moral Gower to correct of your benignity. Probably in 1387, he began the Canterbury Tales. It was a brilliant scheme. To join a varied group of Britons at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, where Chaucer himself had emptied many a tankard of ale, ride with them on their vacation pilgrimage to the shrine of Becket at Canterbury, and put into their mouths the tales and thoughts that had gathered in the travelled poet's head through half a century. Such devices for stitching stories together had been used many times before, but this was the best of all. Boccaccio had assembled for his Decameron only one class of men and women. He had not made them stand out as diverse personalities. Chaucer created an inn full of characters so heterogeneously real that they seem truer to English life than the stuffed figures of history. They live and very literally move. They love and hate, laugh and cry. And as they jog along the road, we hear not only the tales they tell, but their own troubles, quarrels, and philosophies. Who will protest at quoting once more those spring-fresh opening lines? When that April with his showers sweet the drought of March hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vine in sweet liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flower. When Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath inspired hath in every holt and heath the tender crops, and the young sun hath in the ram his half-course run, and small fowls make melody that sleepen all the night with open eye, then longen folk to goen on pilgrimages, to fern hollows, couth and sundry lawns. In Southwark at the Tabard, as I lay ready to wenden on my pilgrimage to Canterbury with full devout courage, at night was come into that hostelry well 29 in a company of sundry folk, by adventure y folly, in fellowship, and pilgrims were they all, that toward Canterbury would ride. Then, one after another, Chaucer introduces them in the quaint sketches of his incomparable prologue. A knight there was, and that a worthy man, that from the time when he first began to ride out he loved chivalry, truth and honour, freedom and courtesy. At mortal battles had he been 15, and foughten for our faith at Tramesine. And though that he were worthy, he was wise, and of his port as meek as is a maid. He never yet no villainy ne said in all his life, unto no manner wight. He was a very parfit gentle knight. And the knight's son, a young squire, a lover, and a lusty bachelor. So hot he loved that by night or tale he slept no more than doth a nightingale. And a yeoman to serve the knight and the squire, and a most charming prioress. There was also a nun, a prioress, that of her smiling was full simple and coy. Her greatest oath was by Saint Loy, and she was clept Madam Eglantine. Full well she sung the service divine, and tuned in her nose full seemly. She was so charitable and piteous, she would weep if that she saw a mouse caught in a trap, if it were dead or bled. Of small hounds had she, that she fed with roasted flesh or milk and wastel bread. But sore weep she if one of him were dead. Of small coral about her arm she bare a pair of beads, gowded all with green, and thereon hung a brooch of gold full sheen, on which there was first a crowned A, and after Amor vincit omnia. Add another nun, 3 priests, a jolly monk that loved venery, that is, hunting, and a friar unmatched in squeezing contributions out of pious purses. For though a widow had not a shoe, so pleasant in his in principio, yet would he have a farthing ere he went. Chaucer likes better the young student of philosophy. A clerk there was of Oxenford also, that unto logic had long ago. As lean was his horse as is a rake, and he was not right fat, I undertake, but looked hollow, and thereto soberly. Full threadbare was his overest courtepy, for he had getten him yet no benefice, nay was so worldly for to have office. For him was liever have at his bed's head 20 books, clad in black or red, of Aristotle and his philosophy, than robes rich, or filthful, or gay sultry. Of study took he most cure and most heed, not a word spake he more than was need. Sounding in mortal virtue was his speech, and gladly would he learn and gladly teach. There was also a wife of Bath, of whom more anon, and a poor parson, rich of holy thought and work, and a ploughman, and a miller, who had on the top of his nose a wart, and thereon stood a tuft of hairs red as the bristles of a sow's ears, and a monciple, or buyer for an inn or a college, a reeve, or overseer for a manor, and a sumner, or server of summonses. He was a gentle harlot, rogue, and a kind. A better fellow should men not find. He would suffer for a quart of wine a good fellow to have his concubine a 12-month, and excuse him at full. With him rode a gentle pardoner, his wallet lay before him in his lap, brimful of pardons, come from Rome all hot. And there was a merchant, and a man of laws, a franklin or freeholder, a carpenter, a weaver, a dyer, a tapier or upholsterer, a cook, and a shipman. And there was Geoffrey Chaucer himself, standing shyly aside, large, fat, and difficult to embrace, and looking forever upon the ground as if to find a hare. And not least was mine host, owner of the Tabard Inn, who vows he has never entertained so merry a company. Indeed, he offers to go with them and be their guide, and he suggests, to pass the 56 miles away, that each of the pilgrims shall tell 2 tales going and 2 on the return, and that he who tells the best shall have a supper at our aller cost, a supper at the general expense, when they reach the inn again. It is agreed. The moving scene of this comédie humaine is set. The pilgrimage begins, and the courtly knight tells the first story, of how 2 dear friends, Palamon and Arcite, see a lass gathering flowers in a garden, fall equally in love with her, and contend in a fatal joust for her as the complacent prize. Who would believe that so romantic a pen could turn in a line from this chivalric fustian to to the scatophilic obscenity of the miller's tale. But the miller has been drinking, and foresees that his mind and tongue will slip to their wonted plane. Chaucer apologizes for him and himself. He must report matters honestly, and he invites the chaste reader to skip to some story that toucheth gentleness, morality, and holiness. The prioress's tale begins on a sweetly religious note, then recounts the bitter legend of a Christian boy supposedly slain by a Jew, and how the provost of the town dutifully arrested its Jews and tortured a number of them to death. From such piety, Chaucer passes, in the prologue to the Pardoner's Tale, to a sharp satire on relic-mongering peddlers of indulgences. This theme will be centuries old when Luther trumpets it to the world. Then, in the prologue to the Wife of Bath's tale, our poet reaches the nadir of his morals and the zenith of his power. It is a riotous protest against virginity and celibacy, put into the bawdy mouth of an expert on matrimony. A woman who has had 5 husbands since she was 12 years of age, has buried 4 of them, and looks forward to a 6th to assuage her youth. God bade us for to wax and multiply, but of no number mention made he, of bigamy or of octogamy. Why should men speak of it villainly? Lo, here the wise king, Lord Solomon, I trow he had wives more than one. As would God, it lieful were to me to be refreshed half so often as he. Alas, alas, that ever love was sin. We shall not quote her physiological confessions, nor their masculine counterpart in the Sumner's Tale, wherein Chaucer stoops to study the anatomy of flatulence. The air is cleared when we come to the fable of the ever-obedient Griselda in the Oxford Cleric's Tale. Neither Boccaccio nor Petrarch had told so well this legend dreamed by some harassed male. Of the 58 stories promised in the prologue, Chaucer gives us only 23. Perhaps he felt with the reader that 500 pages were enough, and that the well of his inventiveness had run dry. Even in this bubbling stream there are muddy passages, which the judicious eye will overleap. Nevertheless, the slow, deep current carries us buoyantly along and gives forth an air of freshness, as if the poet had lived along green banks rather than over a London gate, though there, too, the Thames was not far to seek. Some of the paeans to outdoor beauty are stereotyped literary exercises, yet the moving picture comes alive with such naturalness and directness of feeling and speech, such revealing first-hand observation of men and manners as rarely may be found between the covers of one book, and such a cornucopia of images, similes, and metaphors as only Shakespeare would again provide. The pardoner mounts the pulpit, nods east and west upon the congregation like a dove on a barn gable. The East Midland dialect that Chaucer used became through him the literary language of England, a vocabulary already rich enough to express all graces and subtleties of thought. Now, for the first time, the speech of the English people became the vehicle of great literary art. The material, as in Shakespeare, is mostly second-hand. Chaucer took his stories anywhere. The Knight's Tale from Boccaccio's Teseida, Griselda from the Decameron, and a dozen from the French Fabliaux. The last source may explain some of Chaucer's obscenity. However, the most fetid of his tales has no known source but himself. Doubtless he held, with the Elizabethan dramatists, that the groundlings must be given a bawdy sop now and then to keep them awake. He made his men and women talk as matched their rank and way of life. Besides, he repeats, they had drunk much cheap ale. For the most part his humor is healthy, the hearty, lusty, full-bodied humor of well-fed Englishmen before the Puritan desiccation, marvelously mixed with the sly subtlety of modern British wit. Chaucer knew the faults, sins, crimes, follies, and vanities of mankind, but he loved life despite them, and could put up with anybody who did not sell bunkum too dearly. He seldom denounces, he merely describes. He satirizes the women of the lower middle classes in The Wife of Bath, but he relishes her biological exuberance. He is ungallantly severe on women. His mordant quips and slurs reveal the wounded husband revenging with his pen the nightly defeats of his tongue. Yet he speaks tenderly of love, reckons no other boon so rich, and fills a gallery with portraits of good women. He rejects the gentility that rested on birth, and calls only him gentle that doth gentle deeds. But he distrusts the fickleness of the commons, and counts any man a fool who hitches his fortunes to popularity or mingles with a mob. He was largely free from the superstitions of his time. He exposed the impostures of alchemists, and though some of his storytellers bring in astrology, he himself rejected it. He wrote for his son a treatise on the astrolabe, showing a good grasp of current astronomic lore. He was not a very learned man, for he liked to display his learning. He swells his pages with large patches of Boethius, and makes even the wife of Bath quote Seneca. He mentions some problems of philosophy and theology, but shrugs his shoulders at them helplessly. Perhaps he felt, like any man of the world, that a prudent philosopher will not wear his metaphysics on his sleeve. Was he a believing Christian? Nothing could exceed the ruthlessness and coarseness of his satire on the friars in the prologue and the body of the Sumner's Tale. Such darts, however, had more than once been aimed at the brothers by men of orthodox piety. Here and there he raises a doubt of some religious dogma. No more than Luther could he harmonize divine foreknowledge with man's free will. He makes Troilus expound determinism, but in an epilogue he rejects it. He affirms his belief in heaven and hell, but notes at some length that those are bournes from which no attesting traveler returns. He is disturbed by evils apparently irreconcilable with an omnipotent benevolence, and makes Arcite question the justice of the gods with reproaches as bold as Omar Khayyam's. O cruel gods, that govern this world with binding of your word etern, and written in the table of adamant your parliament, and your etern grant, what is mankind more unto your hold than is the sheep that rouketh in the fold? For slain is man right as another beast, and dwelleth eke in prison and arrest, and hath sickness and great adversity, and oft times guiltyless pardie. What governance is in this prescience, that guiltiness tormenteth innocence? And when a beast is dead, he hath no pain, but man, after his death, must weep and plain. The answer of this I leave to divines. In later years he tried to recapture the piety of his youth. To the unfinished Canterbury Tales he appended a Prece de Chaucer, or Prayer of Chaucer, begging forgiveness from God and man for his obscenities and worldly vanities, and proposing, unto my live's end, to bewail my guilts and to study to the salvation of my soul. In those last years his joy in life yielded to the melancholy of a man who, in the decay of health and sense, recalls the carefree lustiness of youth. In 1381 he was appointed by Richard II clerk of our works at our Palace of Westminster and other royal residences. 10 years later, though he was little more than 50, his health seems to have broken down. In any case, his tasks proved too much for his strength, and he was relieved of his office. We do not find him in any later employment. His finances failed, and he was reduced to asking the king for 6 shillings 8 pence. In 1394, Richard granted him a pension of £20 a year for life. It was not enough. He asked the king for a yearly hogshead of wine, and received it in 1398, and when in that year he was sued for a debt of £14, he could not pay it. He died on October 25, 1400, and was buried in Westminster Abbey, the first and greatest of the many poets who there again bear the beat of measured feet.